Chapter 5. Up and Down the Family Tree. Step 1. Discover your spiritual heritage. I have an aunt who loves genealogy. She's the kind of relative who shows up at family reunions with all the collated handouts to distribute, or with full albums of old photographs to lay across the picnic tables, tagged by specific names and dates. Imagine her delight when, as part of her digging around for bits and shreds of family historical information, she came across a well-worn Bible that appeared to have been used by one of our ancestors as far back as the mid-1820s. Turns out this Bible belonged to my great-great-great-great-grandmother, and within its pages this matriarch of our family had written out by hand the names of her children and other family members for whom she was specifically praying. Based on records like these, as well as others, my aunt has deduced that during the early to middle part of the 1800s, many of the women in my direct family tree were women of faith. The men? Not so much. In fact, interestingly, or consequently, most of these forefathers of mine during this period were dying off at early ages, 30s, 40s, younger than average. But the records seem to indicate a shift occurring in my family line after my great-great-great-grandfather came to Christ. From that point on, the men began to live longer, and while this fact alone is certainly not enough to prove direct correlation, a clear thread does start to emerge from the written history, indicating the presence of renewed spiritual interest in their lives, as well as evidence of active leadership in their churches and their homes. As husbands and fathers, I actually knew my great-grandmother, whose husband, my great-grandfather, was a man of faith. I knew my grandfather as well, and of course, my own father, and I knew them all to be men who were serious about their work, serious about their education, serious about the church, and serious about God. Therefore, while the spiritual legacy of my family appears to go back 200 years or more, I know for sure it goes back 4 generations because I've got the memories and, in some cases, the documentation to back it up. This makes my children at least a 5th generation of believers in my family. Think of it, 5 generations. That's at least 100 years of spiritual impact. So when my great-great-grandfather was praying for his family, he was also, without realizing it, praying for me and for mine. When my great-grandfather was worshiping and thanking God for the blessings he'd been given in his life, he was handing down praise as an inheritance to all of us who would follow in his generational footsteps. When my grandfather, deacon in his church, would welcome us to his home for Sunday dinner every week, the words of wisdom that flowed into my life from those afternoon conversations were flowing right through me, eventually flowing down to my children. And when my father was setting an example of Christian integrity and work ethic in our home, he wasn't only inspiring those of us who grew up around him and learned from his influence, he was investing also in his grandchildren, my children, and those who will one day follow after them. That's part of the message I wanted to share with my kids during that first little weekend retreat where we started to talk about launching a new spiritual plan for our family. This journey we were beginning, I told them, was hardly the beginning. They were already swimming in an ocean of legacy that had been streaming in their direction for 100 years or longer. I love the thought of that, the reality of that. Think of the kind of perspective this truth can plant in a child's mind and heart. Because for kids, even more so than for us, they bookend their daily lives inside a fairly confined frame of reference. Except for the times when they're maybe wishing Christmas would hurry up and get here, or when they're dreaming of becoming a pro football player at some point in the future, they generally concentrate on today or what's coming up tomorrow. It's usually not a wide field of vision. But I wanted my kids to see themselves as part of something a whole lot bigger than that, 100 times bigger than that. I wanted to show them how their God, who'd actually been grooming their lives for eternity, had also graciously placed them on planet Earth within a direct 100-year continuum of spiritual blessing. Not only that, I wanted them to receive this legacy with the sense of gratitude it deserved, realizing not every family has this kind of Christian heritage as a reference point. That's what a look at family history can do. Amazing discoveries. I remember a woman running up to me after the part of our workshop where I talk about this subject, looking as if an enormous light bulb had just flashed above her head. She apparently was the aunt in her family who'd made genealogy one of her fun little hobbies and interests. And this slight adjustment of focus I'd introduced had opened up a whole new world of possibilities for her. I'd always just done this genealogy stuff to gather information, she said. You know, to link this person to that person. I'd only seen it as a research exercise. I'd never even thought about approaching it from a spiritual standpoint, as a way of helping us carry on our parents' and grandparents' legacy of faith. Right. She got it. This is not just meant to be a history lesson, a book report. It's much richer, much deeper than that. The spiritual history of your family helps you draw your little circle of household existence inside a much larger, much more purposeful ring of influence, one that rolls backward as well as forward. And that's why, although this overall plan for family discipleship I'm presenting to you doesn't come with a lot of requisites, I believe you'll find this particular one an exceptional way to get started. Nobody ever really drew anything out like this for me when I was growing up. But then again, they didn't really need to. My grandfather and grandmother, for instance, actually lived with us for a short period of time, as did my great-grandmother later on. And even when close family members like these weren't physically living in our house, they were typically only a few streets away in the same neighborhood or a short distance across town. So the reason I inherently knew a lot about the individual members of my extended family was because we saw each other all the time. I remember, for example, playing a lot of losing games of checkers with my grandfather. Anytime you want to win one, he'd say, just let me know. I can still remember standing around talking with him while he worked on the car or the lawnmower or anything else of his, or anybody else's, it seemed, that needed fixing. I remember eating homemade biscuits at the breakfast table with my other grandfather as well, while we talked about life and the Lord and whatever else might come up in casual conversation over cups of his favorite tea. I knew these people. I knew their stories. But those days, for the most part, have come and gone. Families who settle down in one place, especially the same place where the mom or dad grew up, and then stay there for the rest of their lives. Those are the exceptions to the modern rule. In our case, for instance, we moved our kids 9 times in 11 years. And by the time we finally put down some semi-permanent roots in one location, we were a long drive away from either place where Wanda and I were born and raised. So while our children were familiar with some of their relatives and had visited them from time to time, these people weren't a regular part of our kids' experience. They were virtually strangers to each other, even though they shared a heredity of blood and common ancestry. Good chance your kids are in the same boat, I'd imagine, in one way or another. So I'll just tell you, our kids ate this up. They wanted to know more. They wanted to know a lot of stuff that I didn't know either, which set us off on a search together to see what else we could find. But the main objective, again, outside of piquing a lot of healthy curiosity, is to try identifying the spiritual roots and branches in your family tree. It's a snapshot of where your family's been, what God has done, and how you and your children fit into that picture. The spiritual picture, not just the blanks on a genealogical chart. It's a way for each of you, especially your kids, to develop a new sense of belonging, a deeper sense of gratitude, a broadening sense of time and identity, as well as a new reason for keeping up the momentum begun by people who lived in earlier days, but whose lives still create a bearing on what God is doing in our lives, in our day. All right, I can see your mind's already working, so let's break here for a couple of questions. Here's one I've heard a lot. What if there's not much, if any, Christian heritage on my family tree? What if, as far as I know, I'm a first-generation believer? No problem. In fact, in some ways, your situation offers you a little more pioneering excitement than those of us who grew up being taken to church and taught about the Lord from as long as we can remember. It starts with you now. You're the first in what, by God's grace, could represent a completely new fork in the direction of your family legacy. I realize, of course, you can't make your children become Christians. Salvation is not an inheritable commodity. You can plant the seeds and water them well. Only God can give life and growth. But you stand now at the threshold of an incredible opportunity that's as rich with spiritual potential as your past has perhaps been bereft of it. Not only have you been given the privilege of impacting future decades and centuries with the witness of Christ's forgiving love, but you can also go back now into the buried root system of your family tree and patiently seek opportunities both to share and exemplify gospel truth with generations past as God opens those doors. But either way, You're on the leading edge of what could now become a fountainhead of Christian impact, fingering through your kids' lives and on out into the future. Hopefully for hundreds of years if the Lord waits that long. Isn't that cool to think about? I know you'd say perhaps you've missed a lot by not knowing Christ from a younger age, by not being surrounded with people all along who could have helped you grow in your faith so you wouldn't be needing to learn it all so fast as a grown-up. But because of your eagerness to impart biblical grounding underneath your own children's lives now, you can help ensure that another generation will not grow up without knowing, without being able to remember who God is and what he can do, because they've seen it and know it themselves. That's pretty exciting. Well, our family does have some Christians in it, but also a lot of trouble and brokenness and breakdown, some of which our kids know about, some they don't. It's not a very pretty picture, really. Not much of a spiritual legacy. Here's where I think each of us can benefit from a paradigm shift, because the same adjustment that helps us view our genealogy from a spiritual rather than biological perspective needs to come all the way down into our hearts where we can view the entirety of life from a spiritual vantage point as opposed to a physical one. This is not how we're wired, of course. It's not our reflex default, but it's the basis for truly understanding the gospel and truly understanding ourselves. If given our way, we'd like to be known for how wonderful we are, how successful we are, how strong we are, how wise we are. Only one problem: we're not wonderful. Wonderfully made, yes, by a wonderful God. Psalm 139, verse 14. But not so wonderful in the execution. None of us. Romans 3, verses 10 through 18. That's what led Paul the Apostle to say, both of himself and of us, if I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. For when I am weak, then I am strong. 2 Corinthians 11:30, 12:9-10. Our glory is not found in what we do and accomplish, but in what God can do and accomplish with such imperfect, uncooperative, intractable, unmanageable pieces of building material. Like us, and like our families. I mean, if life weren't real, if we could spin the story any way we wanted, we'd strike some things from the record that don't cast ourselves or our family in the most favorable light. There wouldn't be any divorces, wouldn't be any alcoholism, wouldn't be any unwed pregnancies, wouldn't be anything that required footnoting or justifying or further explanation. But reality begs to differ. The good mingles with the bad. And while even our good is ultimately indebted to God's favor and blessing and the kindness of his mercy, so also the bad, both in ourselves and in our families, is living proof that he continues to seek us, that he continues to persevere with us, that his word and his faithfulness will not be outmuscled or outmatched by whatever kind of sinful rebellion tries to stand in his way. In God's economy, there are no leading families in society, no haves and have-nots. There's just your family and my family, with lots of baggage and brokenness, even in the best of families. But everything that turns up from digging into our family's spiritual past is intended, good or bad, to point ultimately toward God's plan for how he's kept working with us. And this same God, with his same plan, intends to keep working now through your nuclear family, through both the good and the bad, to bring to himself the glory due his name. And that's pretty exciting too. Carry it forward. I will open my mouth in parables, one of the psalm writers said. I will utter hidden things, things from of old, what we have heard and known, what our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children. We will tell the next generation. Psalm 78, verses 2 through 4. I want to lay down a challenge for you here, a challenge not to hide these things from their children. Their children? You mean our children? Yes and no. As much as they're your children, they're also the children of your ancestors, your parents and grandparents. And they need to know these people's stories, even as your children have come to know yours. Some of the greatest treasures in our possession today at the Chatmon household are the recordings we've made from in-person interviews that we conducted with a number of men and women from our family's past. Naturally, we don't have the same kind of stories from those who'd already died before we started taping, and those whom we do have on tape will each pass away themselves in due course of time. As will I, as will you. But we must not let their stories die. We must not hide them from their children. We must make these memories available to be seen and heard, not only for the next generation, but for many next generations to come, so that they, unlike us, can experience for themselves the great-great-greats in their family line, whose faith forms a years-long connection throughout the decades and centuries. In Chapter 7, we'll be looking at your family's vision and how to encapsulate it into a vision statement that you can keep in front of each other as a rallying point for how you think and operate. In our family, as we sought to identify what we wanted our vision to be, we landed on one which we've also shortened into a simple motto: unity in the spirit. That's our aim. That's what we want to increasingly embody throughout our lives together. And one of the activities that feeds into this deep desire is the personal awareness of our spiritual unity, not only with each other and with our contemporary brothers and sisters in Christ, but also with those from our family's past with whom we share believing faith. Your family's vision, of course, could be something else entirely, as you think through what makes you distinctive and unique. But all of our families can benefit and be enriched, I believe, by learning the stories of our predecessors, captured if possible for all posterity. It's a little quirky, how the things people find so commonplace, if given enough years and generational distance, become valuable collector's items. A letter opener or a sewing basket that once was merely something that sat around on our grandparents' desk or beside one of their favorite chairs is now an heirloom, a treasure, something we're so glad didn't get thrown away when they downsized their home or graduated to their eternal one. The same is true of their stories. They may not seem so unusual or extraordinary. Not to them. They may not even have thought about some of these stories in, my goodness, I can't remember when. But these stories are precious and fleeting. They belong to the legacy that God has chosen to create within your family. I encourage you to give some thought to this task if you haven't already. Go and interview them. Ask them some questions. Find out how they came to Christ. Find out who was inspirational to them in keeping their faith alive and burning. Find out some of the hardships and struggles that put them to the harshest of tests and how God led them through the storms with greater trust and dependence on the assurance of His loving faithfulness. Find out what they remember about their own parents and grandparents, about their siblings and other relatives. Find out what they recall having an impact on them when they were the current age of your children, or what they remember thinking about or wanting to become when they were that age. I realize, thanks to our technological advances, we've now got unprecedented access to websites and databases that can churn up previously unknown material from our family's past. But think of the amount of unknown material that exists only in the temporary hard drive of your family elders' memory banks. And answer this: what else were you planning to do next Saturday that would be so much more important to your legacy than spending an afternoon with the camera rolling at your parents' or grandparents' or aunts' or uncle's house? These are the people who go back with you further than anybody else in your life. And yet I'll bet there's a lot of priceless gems of experience from their personal histories that you've never heard before. And certainly your kids have never heard them before. Yet as James said, you do not have because you do not ask. James 4:2. Just think what you could have if you did. I think you've probably talked enough with these loved ones of yours about the weather in their area, about the status of their arthritis, and other such smatterings of small talk that spill out when you catch up by phone or whatever. But you and your children could move the decimal point several placeholders on your overall blessing quotient by seeking real life with these people. Whether some of them are talkative or soft-spoken, we need what these various characters in our family can reveal to us about what they've learned, what they've seen, what they've experienced, and what they know. Prepare for some unforgettable moments to come to life as you jog their memories. A charge to keep. Abraham understood it. For I have chosen him, God said, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord. Genesis 18:19. Moses understood it. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. Exodus 3:15. Seems wise, then, that we and our children should understand it, that God doesn't operate merely within 70 or 80-year lifespans, none of which is any more than a tiny blip on the radar screen of eternity. Something great happens when we realize we're playing in a much bigger pool than we thought, and that his plans for us can actually outlive us by measures of centuries. You probably came to this book and this idea the same way I came to it, asking God to help you lead your family to love his word and do his will. What I hope comes clear, if nothing else, from the upshot of this chapter is that the impact of this noble desire of yours can actually carry beyond your immediate intentions. The value of taking up this weighty responsibility is a promise you're making to people you don't yet know. Some you'll never know till eternity. When the Lord instructed Moses to ordain Aaron and his sons as the first generation of priests over Israel, Moses led them through a number of ceremonial reminders to help them grasp the significance of their new office. This role they were initiating under God's direction would first be carried out, of course, among the people who made up the nation of Israel at that time in history, but the role of the priesthood would actually be carried forth across many other generations to follow, beginning with these ordinary men who'd been commissioned to a role of important spiritual leadership. So I note with interest how, at the culmination of their initial training period, they were commanded to remain at the tabernacle day and night for a full week and to keep the Lord's charge. Leviticus 8:35 HCSB. To follow what God had commanded them, to pay special heed to what he'd taught them. Keep the Lord's charge. That's how I describe what 4 generations or more of ordinary people in my family did and have done for me out of devotion to the Lord. They stood at their post, they held their position, they did what they'd been instructed by the word, and they delivered a heritage of faith right down into the delivery room where I was born. Today, I want to link arms with these saints in keeping the Lord's charge for my family, knowing that just as their faithfulness extended beyond them to a 5th generation, represented now by Wanda's and my children, my own faithfulness can now be part of delivering a legacy of faith to another 100 years of children down the line. Come join me in this humble endeavor. When you're fighting off another temptation towards sin tomorrow, realize you're fighting not only for your own purity, but for the benefit of your children and maybe others yet to be born who will grow up in the wake of a godly family line. When you're feeling too tired or busy to pray this evening, realize you're interceding to the one who's already laying plans for the spiritual fruit to be harvested in generations ahead of you. When you're not sure you can make the sacrifices entailed in leading your family to love and cherish their relationship with Christ, realize you're making an investment whose earning potential can't even be measured in currency values. I don't want to stop at 100 years. I want to keep it going. We've been given too much, whether in legacy or potential, to even think about backing away from this now. Step out into the ocean that connects you by God's divine action with those who've gone before, as well as with those who are still to come. It's the perfect position for making 100 years or more worth of difference.